Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with the Bill of Rights Institute, here for a little bit of AP US History Review. It's going to be the first of several AP Preparedness webinars, okay? And I am here looking at the chat, and I stared at the screen for a few moments, but now we are live. And let's go ahead and get the chat going. Now, our topic this evening is going to be Colonial America. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on Colonial America and thinking in terms of what's we're going to encounter on the exam. Oh, I scared somebody. Hey there, Amy, and Justin is here. Sebastian, good to see y'all tonight. All right, so as far as what we're going to be focusing on. If you've got any questions that are specific to Colonial America, go ahead and ask me those questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and get those questions out there. And we're also going to be covering a set number of topics because we've got a very neat defining line here. Okay, so as far as that goes, first of all, let's start at the very beginning. Now, our course and the exam are going to start in the year 1491. Now, 1491 is a symbolic year, okay? It's a year that represents the North American continent and South American continent, the New World, basically, before European contact, okay? So when we look at 1491, even though pre-1607 is only about 5% of the exam. The College Board estimates that pre-1607 is only going to be about 5% of the exam, but it's still something that we want to get out there. Now, when we go to, before the French and Indian War, we're getting a little more than that. So about 15% of the exam is going to be on Colonial America. Okay, so as far as that goes, let's start with the very beginning. And there are going to be times when I'm going to send y'all linked material in the notes. Okay, actually, it's not letting me. Okay, you know what I'm going to do here? I believe, yeah, I'm going to send links to. Okay, excellent. Okay, so when I've got links to send, you're going to see the Bill of Rights Institute post these links in the chat, and I'm going to be sharing some things with you and going over the main ideas. So you see that the Bill of Rights Institute has linked something that's on my website, and this is just a good study aid for you because I have a let's see, as far as that goes, I have a video on this topic. And then I also have this blog post where I've got some things that are going to be very useful to you. Okay, so when we look here, our first thing, and you're welcome to watch this video if you want something in depth, but this is my video lecture on Native American cultures. And so as far as the key concepts in terms of what you really need to know in order to do well on this part of the exam and understand it. First of all, we need to understand that Native Americans were diverse, all right, that there were a diverse group. They didn't all speak the same language. They didn't all get their food the same way. Now, they all interacted with their environment in the same way. Like we see that each tribal group interacted differently with its environment, but these are going to be like what they have in common is they're interacting with their environment, but they do it in different ways. So, for example, if you look at Southwestern Native American tribes, you're going to see that they are very tied to corn or maize agriculture, M-A-I-Z-E, that they're growing corn out there in in these areas of the Southwest. Okay, we're thinking about like Arizona, New Mexico, and places like this. And so going from there, if we look at the Northeast, we are going to see a reliance on agriculture, but also in hunting and gathering. Okay, so when we go to the South, for example, now let me go ahead and throw this up on the screen, okay, because I've got a graphic organizer that I think is going to be helpful to you. And that's also available on that blog post. Okay, so the video, the graphic organizer, all of that stuff is available. And I'm just going to put that here that when we're looking at these Native American cultures, now I've got a few tribes that are characteristic. You don't necessarily need to know the names of all these tribes. These are just characteristic tribes. Now, some of these tribes, I would say, for example, example, the Iroquois and the Cherokee and the Pueblo. These are, and so looking at that, and then Plains Indians in general, like knowing the Sioux would not be a bad idea, but these are just given as illustrations. So when you hear about the Cherokee Indians in the course, then you're thinking about, okay, that they tended to live in settled communities. They tended to practice agriculture. Now, we want to remember as well the Mississippian culture that existed in 1491, hundreds of years before European contact. If any of you live in the St. Louis area, you may have seen the Cahokia mounds. These are outside of St. Louis, and the Mississippian cultures, these cultures that lived in the Mississippi Valley and the American Southeast, they tended to build these massive mounds. There's actually one in Louisiana that's shaped like a snake. I mean, it's a very ambitious, very ambitious mound. But understanding as well, like I think that the average person has this stereotype of like Native Americans as all being Plains Indians. Okay, like you might have seen Dances with Wolves, and you're seeing them live in teepees. They're migratory, nomadic, and they hunt buffalo. But when it comes down to it, a lot of natives lived in settled communities. A lot of natives practiced agriculture. Now, also natives that live close to the coast, such as natives in California and the West Coast, they would bring seafood into their diet, a lot of fishing. So that is important to note here. So understanding these different characteristics, the Southwest, knowing about these cliff dwellings and these Pueblo houses. And so those are things that are important here, just to kind of understand that there are these main regions that we see here. Now, Great Basin, I don't necessarily ever see on the exam. It should be in most cases sufficient to know, Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, Great Plains. And if you want to include California as well, certainly want to welcome everybody here from California. Of course, I'm over here on the East Coast. I might find these more accessible. So the main thing is just to take away those big understandings, okay, that they were diverse. There were many different language and culture groups, and that each tribal group interacted differently with its environment, understanding that there are, in most places, settled communities. Okay, so that's something that is important. Also, one thing to note would be gender roles. Okay, when we think about the contact between Native Americans and Europeans, okay, these European settlers and these Native American settlers, I'm thinking in terms of how they interacted socially, and especially in terms of gender roles. So, for example, Europeans that were coming to the New World, especially like English colonists who are coming to the New World to make money off of agriculture, that European agriculture was something that European agriculture is labor intensive. Okay, like when you think about a horse or a mule driven plow, that this requires a lot of upper body strength. So with the Europeans, agriculture, going out and working in the fields, plowing the fields was seen as a man's work. That's something a man's supposed to do. Now, also we've got to consider that the Europeans had livestock. Now, that's part of the Columbian Exchange. Okay, when we think about the Columbian Exchange, we're thinking in terms of cattle, sheep, pigs. That's cattle, sheep, pigs. Also, horses are coming along there. So when we think about livestock, we're thinking about these domesticated animals, a lot of them grown to eat. So when we think about European culture at the time of colonial America, what we're looking at is that hunting is seen as a sport, whereas the natives who did not have any kind of, these natives did not have livestock, that hunting is not a sport for wealthy people, for people who are privileged. It's how they got their food. So when you look at the division of labor in a lot of these native tribes, the men were involved in hunting, and they brought back these animals. They risked their lives out there, in some cases hunting, and brought back these sources of protein. whereas women would gather and farm. And so the Europeans, they had this perception of native men as being lazy. Because they didn't do the agricultural labor. But then again, that is a cultural misunderstanding. Now, I've alluded to the Columbian Exchange, and let me go ahead and get into that a little bit more. Yeah, Justin is saying Columbian Exchange. Okay, so there we go. Let me just take a quick look at the chat. Yeah, as far as Valeria, when we see links, we definitely want to click on those when I send them, because I'm sending you things that are going to be useful to you. So that's something that you definitely want to take a look at. All right, so with that, and I would also, if you find this this session to be useful, I would definitely encourage you to follow BRI. Let's see, BRI students on Instagram. They are going to be posting things here, which you note here that I am following BRI students. Okay, so that's going to be useful to note here. I'm following BRI students on Instagram. So make sure that you are going to be you're going to get all the information about when these things are going to be happening. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the Columbian Exchange. Okay, and what we want to note about the Columbian Exchange is that we want to note what's going back and forth, and that it's not just animals. Okay, that we want to note that it's not just animals. There's a lot of stuff that is happening. And the other thing we want to note is that we don't necessarily need to know everything. Okay, don't start looking for every single animal, for every single plant or anything like that, but think of a few characteristic things. Now, we also want to note that the Columbian Exchange includes an exchange of people. It includes an exchange of ideas, which hopefully y'all washed your hands, staying away from that coronavirus, that diseases. Okay, we're actually living this right now. That we are in a situation, you see what's happening here and how much panic there is when there is a disease going around that is not necessarily fatal for a large number of people, but it's fatal for some, and we have no vaccine and no cure and no immunity to it. So you can see what's happening right now. So you imagine, like, when Europeans who had developed immunities to some of these diseases, when they got to the Americas, these diseases devastated the native populations. And understand that at the time, they didn't understand germ theory. They didn't understand the concept of social distancing. They didn't understand incubation periods. And so these, these diseases swept through, and, although some natives died from warfare, starvation, mistreatment, disease by far was the biggest part, of the Columbian Exchange that made a difference. Now, there are historians who who believe that that actually the natives sent syphilis back to the old world. That's where that started to make an appearance in the old world. So, but by and large, most diseases came from the old world to the new world. So that's something that you want to note here. I've seen questions to that effect, making sure you understand that this was an epidemic that was brought over, not necessarily on purpose, but caused a great deal of devastation, which you're kind of seeing in front of you right now, as you see that if you go out on the road, there aren't many people out there. A lot of people are staying in. A lot of people are scared, and we've even got the benefits of modern technology and medicine. So going into the Columbian Exchange, we see here we've got some New World native plants and Old World native plants. Okay, now one thing that I like to latch on to, I like to think about things that kind of roll off the tongue. So when I think about New World native plants, look at here. We've got a tomato and a potato. All right, so we've got the potato and the tomato, and you think about this, tomato, tomato, potato, potato, right? And so when you look at this, what I'm thinking is they sound alike, but we also want to think about the influence. So for example, can you imagine French food without Potatoes. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? Well, before the Columbian Exchange, the French didn't know what a potato was. The Italians didn't know what a tomato was. So what we want to note is this Columbian Exchange isn't just a matter of we brought things over from the other side, but these things that are brought over from the other side end up being life-changing. So that's something to note here. Now, then we see some things like, bananas. That's something that for the first time, these are brought from the old world to the new world. And what's important about that is you think about like bananas today, they grow very well in Central America. So what happens is a lot of these things that are coming over, citrus, we think about citrus, oranges, limes, we think about Florida when we think about oranges, but Florida didn't have any oranges before the Columbian Exchange. So a lot of these things that we associate with places here in the New World today, they weren't here before. And so from there, we want to think about, now I'd mentioned before, now, of course, the exchange of peoples. Okay. So with the slave trade, we see that that is also part of the Columbian Exchange, where you see that, part of this triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americans, where you've got the Americas, where you've got the raw materials coming from the colonies. You have the finished goods coming from Europe and slaves coming from Africa through the Middle Passage. So that is also part of the Columbian Exchange. Now, as far as livestock, okay, so when we think about livestock, let's remember, just like potatoes and tomatoes coming from the New World changed the cuisine in Europe, we also see how the introduction of some of these animals, for example, our stereotypical view of Native Americans, as I said, often tends to be riding on horseback and hunting buffalo and living this migratory existence. Well, before the introduction of the horse came from the old world. So we see here that that the natives incorporated some things from the old world into their lives, and it changed things for them. So one thing that you want to be careful about is to not view natives as being acted upon by Europeans coming in from the old world. That they are, in a lot of ways, their lives are being changed by things that are introduced from the old world, and things that they're introducing to the new world are changing as well. And so we see the beginning of the global trade that we have today in the Columbian Exchange. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and monitor the chat for a second and see what questions may be coming up. I want to hit some key topics, but I also want to be responsive to questions. So as far as that goes, someone's literally in a Popeyes drive-through. I hope you are not. Driving, okay? But hopefully somebody's driving for you. All right, so with that, let's go ahead. If anybody's got a question for me, let's go ahead and put those into the chat. Kaylee, I would say that well, first of all, the biggest impact would be the diseases. I would say the diseases were a very big impact, and also the horse. That would be the horse would be second. Like when you think about the lives of the Plains Indians, that the horse would be something that was making a big difference there. In their lifestyles. And of course, that hunting bison on horseback is something that is going to last until the late 19th century, after the Civil War, where you've got the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. All right. Well, good luck. Good luck getting those fives, right? So now let's go into, what exactly? Okay. So we've got SCAR CSU updated. So let's go ahead and look at the different, the differences and the similarities between these colonial powers. Okay. So let's go ahead and make some notes about this. Okay, so let me go in here. I just need to open up my drive real quick. Oops. Oh, it would help if I spelled drive correctly. All right. Okay, so one thing I'm going to note here, I'm going to send you a graphic organizer. Okay, so I'm going to put the Bill of Rights Institute is going to share this. This is a graphic organizer that I've got that goes along with videos that I've made on French, Spanish, Dutch, and English colonization. Okay, so you can find, Tom Richey, New Spain, Tom Richey, New France, and this goes to this graphic organizer that I've got here. So yes, one of our big themes is going to be taking these four colonizing powers and noting similarities and differences. When we think about comparison on the APUSH exam, then that's something that is going to be very important here, noting similarities and differences. Now, of course, I'm not going to be able to give you the whole rundown of all of the videos there, but we can go into some of these key components. And I'm going to kind of talk you through this for a bit. I'm going to put this organizer up on the screen, and so we can chat about that. Okay. So going into that, thank you very much as far as somebody liking my mug. All right, so a good view of the mug. This is actually, it's got Henry VIII's 6 wives. Now, I saw Six the Musical a few weeks ago. Broadway's closed down right now, but I saw it before it closed. And so when there's a hot beverage in the cup, you always see Henry, but the wives' heads disappear when the beverage is hot, and as the beverage cools down, you start to see them again. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Okay, so again, this is giving you a broad overview here of what we're going to what we're going to see on the exam. So looking at this coming up, we want to think about what are we going to do here to compare. And so first of all, you think about, like, who are the Catholic powers. So first of all, we want to think, now you want to think about where they are as well. Okay, so the Spanish, they are in the American Southwest, they're in Florida, and then they're in Latin America. The French are in French Canada. They are also in Louisiana, basically in the Mississippi Valley. The Dutch in present day New York and New Jersey, largely, maybe a little bit even in present day Connecticut. And then the English being on the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies. Now, one thing that we want to note here in terms of religion, okay, now I've got religion here, and then I've also got down near the bottom evangelism, okay, and they kind of go hand in hand here, okay, because what we're looking at, first of all, were they Protestant or Catholic? Now go ahead and ask yourself, who were the Protestant colonizers and who were the Catholic colonizers? Give you just a second to digest that. All right. So as far as that goes, the colonizers who were Catholic were the Spanish and the French, and the Dutch and the English were Protestant. So if we're comparing the Spanish and the French, we would then say that they have a similarity, that they're both Catholic. And then if we were comparing the French and the Dutch, we would say, well, the French were Catholic while the Dutch were Protestant. Now, something that happens to go hand in hand here, one of the lines here is evangelism. So when we're looking at evangelism, we're asking ourselves, like, was there a state-sponsored program of evangelizing the natives? Okay, was there a state-sponsored program? And in the case of the Spanish and the French, yes, there was a state-sponsored program of evangelism, and not so much with the Dutch and the English. So what you can see here, now, were there Dutch and English missionaries? Sure, but not on the scale of the Spanish and the French. So that's another thing we can see here, is there seems to be a trend at that time with the Catholic countries being much more aggressive about evangelizing the natives and converting them to Christianity. Now, the Spanish were very, very successful with this. You look at Latin America, and Catholicism is very much a part of Latin American life today. So that's a lasting legacy there. And so then when we look at the Dutch and the English, no state-sponsored program. So then we're going to take a look. And again, you can fill out this entire graphic organizer if you watch my videos on, I've got a video for the Spanish, a video for the French, the Dutch, and the English. Now, the next thing we want to look at is economic pursuits. What were they doing? Okay. And so when we think about the Spanish, we've got the encomienda, which was a system of labor and tribute. The Spanish, now all four of these colonizers, what they have in common is they're all trying to make money some way or another. But it's how they're trying to make money. Okay. So the Spanish, what we're looking at there with their economic pursuits, the encomienda, that they are, that they are using Indian labor in order to profit. Whereas the French and the Dutch were both involved in trade. So this is what's important to note here, is that while the French and the Dutch had different religions, the French and the Dutch had similar economic pursuits. Okay, so similar economic pursuits, although they were different religions. And so then they had a similar kind of relationship in the sense that their economy was based on exchanges. Okay, now of course the French had a friendlier relationship than the Dutch, because the French were of course trading, and they were also concerned with saving souls. Now that tended to go okay, because when you think about an exchange-based relationship, that's something that an exchange-based relationship is something that lends itself to treating someone as equals. Whereas, and so the French are treating the natives as equals. They are also evangelizing them. And then meanwhile, the Dutch, really, the Dutch are, even when you go to France and the Netherlands today, the Dutch are, a bit less sentimental than the French. If you stay at a French Airbnb, they're probably going to put some breakfast items out there for you. With the Dutch, if you want if breakfast wasn't included, you're probably not going to see anything. And so that's a cultural thing. So then the English are different economically. Okay, so the English are different economically in the sense that they are coming to farm. Okay, so the English are coming to practice cash crop agriculture. And so that's different because it's a lot more, it's basically, when you think about the relationship with the natives. Okay, now before we get to that, let's note number of colonists. Not only are the French and the Spanish both Catholic, but in terms of the number of colonists, few people. Okay, so we've got few colonists for the Spanish and the French, and the Dutch have more than the Spanish and the French. But we want to note, which makes sense, what language am I speaking right now that you're required to use for your AP exam? The English language. Why is it that people speak the English language here? Because the English sent people in droves, that there were many more people coming from, from to the English colonies than anywhere else. Okay. And then, so when we think about this, the relationship with the natives, I like to use General Patton's lead me, follow me, or get out of my way. And the Spanish definitely wanted the Indians to follow them. They built these mission stations where the Indians would show up and they would learn the Spanish language. They would go to church. They would pay taxes. They wanted them to become part of the Spanish society. Now, the French and the Dutch being involved in exchanges, it was a bit more of a lead me. Okay, that the French and the Dutch, they would participate in native ceremonies. They saw that it was important to these people that they were doing business with. And so, they were like, lead me, show us how you do things and how we can get along with you and do better business. And, with the French, with their Jesuit priests, instead of building missions, the French priests tended to live among the natives. Now, another thing that that is noted is that Frenchmen were most likely, because the French and the Spanish brought very few women, that French colonists were very prone to marry native women. That helped helped integrate them into the community and help them to do business. So when you look at native tribes, there really wasn't like so much of a separation of business and personal relationships, that if we do business, we're friends, and if we're friends, we do business. And now the English, if you're looking at General Patton's line, the English are more like, get out of our way. Okay, just get out of our way, and that's it. So as far as that goes, now if we were thinking about an SAQ or something like that, or even an LEQ, that a lot of times, like SAQ 3 and SAQ 4, they're going to focus on, they're going to focus on finding a similarity and finding a difference. Okay, so if we were going to say, like, what was a similarity between the Spanish and the French? Identify one similarity between the Spanish and the French, like identify and explain. Now, you don't want to just write short answers in one word. You want to think as far as we want to explain those as well. Okay. So what if we were finding a similarity between the Spanish and the French? And while I'm waiting on y'all to answer that, the Black Legend. Okay, so Valeria, you're asking about the Black Legend. Now, this is what's happening there is Bartolomé de las Casas. Okay, he was a Spanish priest in the New World, and he documented a lot of abusive treatment of natives. Now, when you're reading over, okay, when you're reading over let's see, when you're reading over the treatment of the Spanish toward the natives from De las Casas. Now De las Casas wasn't necessarily like being he wasn't coming out and intentionally lying, but when you read De las Casas, there's an element of, it seems like some of this stuff he's probably hearing about. Did he really see all of it? That there's a lot of a lot of folks have argued that De las Casas is exaggerating at best. Like the accounts there of the way the Spanish were treating the natives are probably somewhat exaggerated. Now, is that to say the Spanish had a great relationship with the natives? No. Or they treated them great? No. But we have to think about the purpose of De las Casas when he's writing, that De las Casas was a priest and he's trying to convert natives. And when you think of it from that perspective, when he sees the Spanish colonists taking advantage of the natives, not treating them well, it is making his job harder. And when you look at his purpose, okay, De las Casas' purpose is to try to get rid of the encomienda. And since his purpose is to get the Spanish government to put an end to the encomienda, then what it says is, when you think about his purpose, he has an interest in portraying Spanish treatment of the natives in the worst possible light. So that's something that's important to think about. Well, that's Grant. This is basically my job. So yeah, I do really. I mean, this is part of my job. So I kind of have to know a lot of this stuff off the top of my head, which it helps as well. If you ask me a question that I don't know off the top of my head, I usually tell you it's probably not on the exam. So yeah, so De las Casas, I mean, he had good motives. Let's be clear, like he had good motives. He definitely cared for the natives, but he wanted this what he saw as an unjust labor system to end. Okay, he wanted this unjust labor system to end, and he's got a stake in portraying the encomienda in the worst possible light. So that's what it means when you go into the so-called Black Legend, that the Spanish probably weren't quite as terrible as they were portrayed by De las Casas. So with that going on, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in a few days, the college, if I'm not mistaken, I see there's a lot of conversation about what the College Board is going to do with the AP exams. What we want to note here is they're scrambling as much as anybody, and they have not made a definitive statement yet. Okay, so so basically March 20th, they've said that they're going to make an announcement. So let's kind of hold back on that. And here's the thing: if we're typing, just to kind of think about this, if we're typing about exam dates and the decisions the College Board's going to make with the exam, we're not focusing on Colonial America. So for the next half hour, let's focus on Colonial America. And Ryan Salmon, a shout out, who loves U.S. history. Okay, so but let's make sure, it's just, I'm going to encourage you to be focused on Colonial America. So as far as that goes, now, Barbara, it wouldn't necessarily be, I mean, I would not go deep into the explorers. Okay. Now, the thing is, what we've got to understand is there's what you need to know for the multiple choice, and there's what could come in handy for the LEQ. So here's the thing. If I were writing an LEQ about the Spanish colonies, it would probably be a good idea for me to know who Hernan Cortez was, right? You think about what you're looking at is, if I've got to make this point, then I want to have somebody that I am, that I'm familiar with. Now, does that mean that you need to know De Soto and Coronado and Pizarro and like all of these other folks? Not necessarily. I would not try to remember every single conquistador, but I don't think it would be a bad idea to at least know one of them. Okay, this exam is going to, it treats people a lot better who have like a lot of knowledge about one thing rather than knowing the names of several people. That's one thing that's very important for this exam, is understanding that name dropping is not really going to, it's not really something that's going to get you anywhere. Okay, so if it seems like name dropping, then don't do it. Okay, you want to make sure that so I would recommend Cortez. Like somebody said, he conquered the Aztecs. Okay, so as far as that goes, I don't know if I would, now you could make and you're fine. You can restate the question. You don't have to hate to restate it. Could I potentially compare the colonization of Manifest Destiny? You could make a comparison in the sense that certainly when you look at, especially with the Spanish and the French colonists, that they believe that they are doing God's work. Okay. Whereas, when we look at the United States, expanding in the mid 19th century, the United States believed that, this is our manifest destiny. This is, God wants us to be here, and God wants us to, to improve this land. That's another thing when you look at, from European colonists to 19th century Americans, this idea that the natives don't really own this land because they haven't improved it. Okay, that they haven't gone in and set up farms and all of these other things that Europeans thought were, that Europeans thought were very important. Okay, so when we think about the Spanish and the French, so when we think about a similarity, that they are both Catholic, they both had organized programs of evangelism. Now, what happens if I were to ask you about a difference between the Spanish and the French? Okay, what would we see there? If we were to think it, look at a difference between the Spanish and the French. All right. So with that, let me go ahead and, wait for y'all, because there's a little bit of a lag in the chat there that I have to remember, correct? Okay. So let me just pull something up real quick. Give me just a second. Okay, so with that, when I have to look up something, go ahead and just wash your hands, right? And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and create a Google document. I'm going to give we'll go ahead and give a link here to this document, and go ahead, so that'll be accessible to you. Now, you're not going to have, let's see, so Colonial. Okay, and I'm going to send this link out to you. Okay, so as far as that goes, now we want to think about the 13 colonies. Okay, and of course, I've also got videos on the 13 colonies. So all of this stuff that I'm going over in a very, with a very broad brush, very generally, remember that this stuff also exists on my YouTube channel as something that's more in depth. Okay, so what we want to think about here is we've got the New England colonies, the middle colonies, and the southern colonies. Okay, so first of all, let's think about the economy. Okay, so when we think about the economy of the 13 colonies, we want to think about New England, first of all, is the only one that is not agricultural, right? So New England is based on shipping and trade. Okay, so basically shipping and shipping, trade, that it is a commercial economy, okay, shipping and trade and a few finished goods. Now, the middle colonies are working with agriculture. Now, in New England, they had agriculture, but it's what you would call subsistence agriculture. Like I could grow enough for my family, but I'm not doing this as a business. Now, of course, you got Ben and Jerry's over in Vermont. You can do some types of commercial agriculture in New England, but it's not really made for that. Okay, so the middle colonies, okay, that's where we have agriculture, and then that is focused on staple crops. Okay, now when we're thinking about staple crops, those are crops to eat. Okay, so when we're thinking about staple crops, we're thinking about wheat and corn, what you would call the bread basket. Okay, so that is what you see in the middle colonies. Now, the southern colonies are also agricultural. So when we think about that, if we were comparing the middle and southern colonies, we would say that they are both based on agriculture. Okay, but in this case, what we have are cash crops. Okay, so we have cash crops. Just like, and when we think about this, we want to think about being in period. Okay, so whereas staple crops would be wheat and corn, the cash crops would be tobacco, rice, and indigo. Okay, now these are crops. When we think about cash crops, these are not crops to eat, these are crops to sell. Now, when we look at colonial America and I say tobacco, rice, and indigo, what do we not see on this list? Okay, that's very important to note. There's something that is a big part of US history, a cash crop, that we don't see during the colonial period. So let's think about what, not only what we see here, but what are we not seeing? Okay, and let me see when y'all are going to do that. Okay, so yeah, and as far as the links, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, when we look at the links that have been shared, those will be put into the video description once that's up. Okay, so when we think about cash crops, yes, cotton. Okay, so when we think about cotton, for example, that is something that is an antebellum crop. So one of the things when we're thinking about multiple choice strategy, we want to think about, when something happened. That one of the biggest distractor types they tend to put on the multiple choice is what they will do here is that they'll put something that's out of period, like it's not even at the same time. So if it's a question set about colonial America and it addresses agriculture, if you see cotton, you know that one cannot be true. Okay, that cannot be true. And so yeah, now as far as sugar, what we want to note about the United States, there's really nowhere in the United States that, Louisiana is about the only place that I know of where sugarcane production is prevalent, in South Louisiana. Now, other than that, sugar is in the Caribbean. Now, sugar is, if you're looking from an AP World or AP Euro perspective, sugar is a very important cash crop. Yeah, but as far as the 13 colonies, none of them are really producing sugar. But you want to understand that in the colonial period, you've got tobacco as a major cash crop. And then by the antebellum period, that major cash crop becomes cotton. So just like that, if it's an antebellum question, then you're going to know, like if it's tobacco, that's more of a colonial America crop. Okay, so yeah, so sugar production is largely in the Caribbean on the islands. Okay, so understand that, and that's really that's not gonna be quite as relevant to US history as if you were taking European or world history. Now, the next thing we would want to know is religion. Okay, so religion. Now, in New England, that's where you've got, really what I would call a fanatical religious mindset. You've got the Puritans and separatists. Okay, and then remember this idea of religious freedom. Okay, like, there's a certain amount of this push class that's kind of got a myth busting element. When we're little, we hear about the pilgrims that came over for their religious freedom. But what we want to remember there are two religious dissenters that I think are important. Now, first of all, we would want to know John Winthrop. Now, he's not a dissenter. Okay. So John Winthrop was the governor. Okay. And he was the one who said a city on a hill, technically a city upon a hill, but I think a city on a hill sounds better. Wait. Okay. The World Health Organization says to dab when you're coughing or sneezing. So I'm trying to make sure every time I cough or sneeze that I'm dabbing. Now, one thing I will tell you, this is my fourth broadcast today, so I don't necessarily have corona, but the nice thing is we've got a nice social distance from each other. Okay, so as far as that goes, we see that now. Dissenters. Okay, so we want to think about religious dissenters: Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Okay, so Anne Hutchinson, who was also a religious dissenter. Now, John Winthrop was the governor, and he said that we're building a city upon a hill. We've got a city on a hill here, and we're trying to show this like religious commonwealth. Okay, we're trying to show that this religious commonwealth is a success, because these were people who had basically been persecuted in England, and they're coming over to show the English that their way is better. And they believe that God is only going to reward them if they were faithful to God's dictates as they saw them. And so basically, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, that she was Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was Roger Williams was a Puritan minister who said that the government should not force people to be church members, that there should be liberty of conscience, that people should not be forced to adopt a certain religious mindset. Imagine that. So when it comes down to it, Roger Williams was the one who was all about religious freedom, okay, the way that we see it in terms of religious toleration. But when Roger Williams preached that, we shouldn't force people to be Christians or church members, they showed him the door, and he went and founded the Rhode Island colony. And so Anne Hutchinson, Anne Hutchinson was a woman who was holding Bible studies at her house. Now, one thing about Anne Hutchinson is that today, nobody would think anything of a woman holding Bible studies at her house. But what we've got to note here is that Anne Hutchinson, in holding Bible studies, people were seeing her as an authority, that they were getting religious instruction from a woman. And then Anne Hutchinson also, when we look at what she was doing, she had some interesting views. She said that she could actually see the elect, these people who were supposed to go to heaven, the way the Puritans saw it. And she said that she could see them, like there was some kind of aura around them or something like that. So the authorities were scared of her, that it's like this woman was getting a lot of credibility and she had a lot of followers. I mean, so she'd be like a social media influencer of some sort today. And so they kicked her out, and she may have been something of somewhat crazy. But then again, that's the beautiful thing about America, that, your beliefs can be as quote unquote crazy as somebody might think. But as long as you're not hurting anybody, then you can believe anything you want here. Okay. Then we go to the middle colonies. Okay. And the middle colonies, we think in terms of tolerant. Okay. That we look at the Pennsylvania colony. Okay, so colony, William Penn, who was a Quaker. Okay, now I've got a video on the Pennsylvania colony and another video about the Quakers, which you're welcome to look at, just depending on how prepared you want to be. Okay, not like you got anything better to do right now, right? If you're, sitting in the house, trying to keep your social distance. And so William Penn and the Quakers, they didn't believe in using any kind of force or coercion. Quakers are pacifist. Okay, so no force, no coercion, anything like that. And so, this was basically full religious toleration. Okay, so, basically, no matter what your religious beliefs are, the Quakers respected those things. Now, also, we can think of in the Maryland colony. Okay, so Lord Baltimore, we could note that there was Christian toleration in Maryland. Now, Maryland and Virginia, one other thing we want to note is Maryland and Virginia are what we would call Chesapeake colonies, okay, because they're on the Chesapeake Bay. And the thing about Maryland, it's between Virginia and Pennsylvania. Economically, Maryland functioned like a Southern colony, but in terms of religious toleration was more like a middle colony, was more like Pennsylvania. Now, then we look at the South, which is today one of the most religious parts of the country, that we see a very casual attitude toward religion. Okay, so the Church of England, Church of England was typically casual, right? Okay, so the Church of England. Okay, so England was established. People didn't go to the southern colonies for religious reasons. Okay, if you were going to the southern colonies, you were going to try to make money. That was your pretty much your exclusive goal. The South becomes religious later, starting with the First Great Awakening. So when we look at that, we see economy, religion. Now, also, I'll just put something in real quick for politics. Okay, now in New England, you've got the town meetings. Okay, which tended to be Democratic. Okay, Democratic, like in the sense that they got together, they had a town meeting. Those of you who follow politics and you looked at the New Hampshire primary, we see some leftovers of that political culture when you see the candidates going around and going into a diner and sitting down with a small group of people and talking to them. New Hampshire still has that old political culture where everybody sits down together and makes decisions together. Now, also, so what you see here is that in the southern colonies, you see a more hierarchical, so a hierarchical, social structure, which was based on land ownership. Okay. Now but you still had representative government. Okay. Which is a tradition that we have in the United States today. Okay, we think about the Virginia House of Burgesses. Okay, the Virginia House of Burgesses is the oldest, the oldest legislative body in the first legislative body ever founded in North America. And so the Virginia House of Burgesses would be an example of something where basically the large landowners made decisions for the rest of the community. Now, we don't necessarily have to get too much into the middle colonies there, but understanding economics, religion, and politics. Okay, so when we're thinking about that, we would be thinking in those terms. And so going from there, there was an SAQ that you might want to look into. That was from the 2018 exam. Okay, so if we think about this, the 2018 APUSH SAQ number 3. Okay, the way that the SAQs work, and I'll go ahead and link that. Okay, so 2018 APUSH free response. And so when you go to SAQ number 3, we're going to go ahead and link that if you'd like to practice that one. That's going to ask you to make a comparison between the Spanish colonies and the New England colonies. So one thing we want to make sure that we're ready to do is that, so if we're thinking about this, some extra practice. Okay, so you can go to the 2018 APUSH SAQ number 3. And what we want to be ready to do is not just to compare the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, but sometimes you can get a curveball because on that one, they're asking you to compare the Spanish and the New England colonies. So you have to be ready, not just with like comparing these 4, comparing these 3, but understand that anybody they can ask you to compare any of the 7. So they could say, hey, compare the Southern colonies with New France and, see how you feel, see what you can do with that. So that's something that I would definitely recommend as some extra practice. Now, let me go. We've got a few minutes left. Let me just note here that let me take questions. Okay, let me take a look here. So we've got here a Burgess. Now, it's not what's a Burgess. I wouldn't necessarily like go that deep into it, but you do want to understand that the House of Burgesses was typically made up of people who were aristocratic. Okay, so there was an aristocratic background there, and so that's something that you want to note. Whereas the town meetings, those were much more democratic. Okay. So as far as that goes, we've got a very serious group here. Now, Rich, the Southern colonies, we want to note when we talk about the Southern colonies, we're talking about Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, south of there, that when you look at Florida and then the American Southwest and Latin America, the Spanish colonies tended to be to the south, which in fact, if we want to get a little deeper into it, and we usually would, the Georgia colony was founded as what we would call a buffer colony, because the Spanish were in Florida, and James Oglethorpe, who founded Georgia, he had this plan. He wanted to reform people who had been in trouble, in financial trouble, and convicts and people like that. And so he wanted to help people reform their lives. And then he wanted to reform their lives. But the reason why they were like, you know what, we'll let you have some debtors and convicts is because they were in harm's way. They were basically standing in between South Carolina and the Spanish. So the Spanish had colonies south of the Southern colonies. Okay. But yes, we will, as we get into some other lessons. Next time, we're going to focus on the American Revolution. Then we've got that. Now, how do we tell what info is vital for the exam and what is useful to know? Zane, I've basically focused, like what I've told y'all this evening is I have been, painting things with a broad brush. I'd say that everything that I addressed in this hour is something that's very key. Now, if you're looking to make a 5 and you want to get a surplus of mind about this, then I would encourage you to look at a lot of the individual videos I've referenced. You can take a look at my Colonial America playlist. Okay, so going into this, let me do one more thing because I'm making this reference. So, Tom Richey, Colonial America, APUSH. Okay. Okay, so going into that, I'm going to go ahead and share my playlist, and the Bill of Rights Institute can share that in the chat, and also make sure that that is going to be available in the description later on. But a lot of these videos that I have referenced, all of these videos are on that playlist. So I would say here, my throat's going to be fine. I mean, it's just I did a big broadcasting schedule a day, but from now on, it's going to be alternating between Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursday. Well, the thing is, Mel, I am your history teacher. So that at least right now, and I'm pretty much, I'm going to be a lot of people's history teacher for the next 3 to 6 weeks or however long this thing's going around. So as far as that goes, okay, well, great. Well, Justin, thank y'all so much for the kind words. I'm glad that y'all enjoyed this session. Now, this is going to be going on for the next 3 weeks on Tuesdays and Thursdays. at 6:30 p.m. After which time I plan to take a week off for my spring break. We'll see if that holds, but then we will go back to Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then we're going to have, in the 2 weeks before the exam, we're going to have 9 broadcasts. Okay, so we're going to be doing plenty of stuff. Make sure that you're here watching on the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel. Make sure you are subscribed to the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel. Okay, that's something that I think is important. Make sure you're subscribed, because that way, whenever we go live, you're going to get a notification. You don't, definitely mark your calendar, but you want a notification as well. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to call it a day, and I will be back on Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and we will focus on the American Revolution. It is always a pleasure.